Hi, and welcome to our this afternoon session with Cindy Suarez, NPQ senior editor. And I'd like to just I'd like to remind you this is going to be a fairly informal session. And just a chance for us to have a back and forth conversation with you on an area of work that one of our senior editors has been deeply involved with for a number of years. Cindy has spent many years involved in movements and social justice work, and in doing that has watched the power dynamics that play out within those organizations and movements, and at some point realized that it would be helpful for us to begin to reflect on how those power dynamics are fed and how they're sustained over time and what you can do to begin to interrupt them. So thank you very much, Cindy, for being with us today. I
Thanks for
do
having
want
me.
to say to people that on the right hand side of your screen that there's a question area, and we really encourage people to ask any questions that they have at any time during our discussion, Cindy and my discussion, and she will address them afterwards to the greatest extent possible. We're going to go somewhere between probably 45 minutes and an hour, and I think what we're going to try to do is to just really get a hold of some of the basic elements of how she puts her ideas together about how power dynamics really infect the interactions between people everywhere in your workplaces and in movements and also in your personal lives. I mean, it happens everywhere. And so she calls them sometimes social dramas, and I'm going to ask her to kind of define that in a minute. But I think I have 10 or 12 of those a day, so at least. So I think one of the things that is great about the work that Cindy's done is that she really looks at the patterns of those interactions and um, helps you to reflect on your own practice and how you're using yourself as a practical agent in every situation. So that said, I want to remind you again that what we're talking today is this book here, which you can see is dog-eared for me and has a lot of notes where I have kind of things I want to remember. But it's called the Manual: How to Master Complex Power Dynamics. Um, and it is available at the publisher, and we'll give you information about that later after we finish this in a follow-up email. So you'll be able to order it from them. That said, I do want to say I think that this is about what a friend of mine used to call witnessing one's own practice. It's kind of how do I become a reflective practitioner so that I understand my own part in the situations that I'm involved in, and I understand how I'm placed in context with other peoples and actors in those situations. And I think it's a higher mode of thinking. It's one where you have to attain some distance, go to the balcony, as they say, and almost be able to see yourself in the interactions with other people. So, Cindy, I want to, in my first question, I just want to ask you about the why. Can you talk about what it is that drove you to write this book? Because I know that you thought about it for a long time before you wrote it, and then you thought about it a lot as you were writing it. And just, what was it that really drove you to spend that much time on this material?
Well, I've always been really interested in power dynamics ever since I was a teenager, probably. And I think in some ways it was just part of the way I was wired to really pay attention. Um, I learned later that I could really pick up a lot from people, and that that's, different people have different ways that they can or can't do that in terms of, how we've developed. But I always tended to be really aware of dynamics around me. I grew up in Roxbury, which is a Black neighborhood of Boston, which at the time especially was a really segregated city. It still is somewhat like many others, but at the time it was more so. And I kind of went to work in downtown. So I kind of felt like I went through at least three different environments in a day. And I had to learn. I was really aware as a kid, having to go through these different, cultural environments, like my Puerto Rican family, my mostly Black neighborhood, my pretty mixed race high school. And then after school, I go to work downtown in a mostly all white space. And that was as a teenager. So I was very aware of, what to wear every day, how to behave, how to talk. And then I had to switch, at school, because I worked at an office and I had to dress up to go to work after. I would be considered a white girl because I spoke proper or because I dressed a certain way. Downtown, I was a girl kind of from the hood, so I had to sort of like be careful. So there was a lot of switching and a lot of being aware of the dynamics underneath that, and then I was kind of aware that in order to be successful in the world personally, I needed to master that. And so that's how it started. I also read a lot. I read a lot of theory as a kid, as a teenager especially. I didn't think of it at the time as power theory, but I think I became really immersed with what I was learning and sort of seeing the application of it immediately. People like Bell Hooks, a lot of feminist scholars, Black literature. I read everything, and I think that was the track for me. I also had a spiritual bent, and it wasn't until I was older that I have kind of got into my current spiritual practice, which is Eastern based. But that also requires a certain level of awareness if you're really going to follow a spiritual practice that is on that focuses on self-realization. So I feel like all those things kind of all my life, and then I chose to work in nonprofit sector and particularly with social justice work. So I think that's what really got me thinking more concretely about what was missing. And I felt like, I would go to work in places where I kind of quickly realized that the intention of the practitioner wasn't always the most important thing at the time, that there was a lot that was, that we didn't have language for, that we weren't aware about. And I just, kept reading, kept practicing, and I moved into organizing, political organizing, where power work became more explicit, and still the ways that we talked about it didn't feel right to me. There was a lot of sort of domination in terms of, that those modes of a certain power weren't questioned. They were just, how do we do that well? And so I think over time, I realized that it really hurt the movement. I mean, long term, there were a lot of ways that unconscious acceptance of dominant power hurt the work, and that there wasn't an alternative frame for it. So I think all of those things together really led me to start, about 5 or 6 years ago, actually sit down to write this. I always knew that I would write a book like this. And I think it took me a long time to really feel like I had learned enough to sit down and start doing that.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a level at which I think you're talking about having been interested since you were a child in these kinds of things, and having to switch between environments where there were different expectations and views of you, and where you had to understand those views in order to be able to manage yourself in those situations. But can you talk a little bit about what you think for people who have not been thinking about that their whole lives, and who essentially react to situations? What are the traps that you can become involved in if you're not conscious of power dynamics in the work that we do?
Wow. I think there are a lot of them, but I think the major ones is that are that you don't see. I think the most important thing is that you don't see the power you have. And I think that was one of the things that really affected me in the work, was the language of powerlessness, even in our search for power. I think, I realized, I think when I started, and I talk about this in the book, when I started to really look at theories, I remember the first one that really stuck out to me was this idea of that these things happen in relationships, and that those things switch back and forth depending on who you're in relationship with, and that there was no set structure, but there was sort of like this weaving of what is Foucault calls it the grid of intelligibility. There are ways that we make sense of things as we're interacting with people.
Right.
So I think that I mean, I think I could see how I had power, even though I may not have been seen as a powerful person in society. And I just thought that when I focused on the power I had, um, it was better. And not that we don't need to be aware of the structures that impinge upon us, but that I felt a lot of the work focused on the structures, systemic oppression. And I think that, yeah, that is important. But as I say in the book, those are the artifacts of our interactions. And I think that there wasn't enough attention paid to how to interact in ways that were mutual, egalitarian, more, more of a back and forth. There was almost no language for that in all the years that I worked in the sector. I've been in the sector for about 30 years, and I just never came across that kind of language. And so I think first of all is, we don't pay attention to the power we have. And I think the second is that we end up dominating other people in our search for power. And I think, and I'll end with this, is that we don't make use of our energy. I think one of the things that I learned when I started to look at different fields and how power shows up biologically, one of the things that really impressed me was this idea that we use glucose. That's our energy. That's what we spend all of our time trying to build up. We work, we eat, we take care of ourselves. We do a lot so that we can have a certain amount of energy to expend in the world. And while that can be fueled, it's not limitless at any one time. So studies were beginning to show that how we use our energy and how conscious we are when we use it, whether we're masterful or not, there were all these differences in how your energy was used, and that your energy can be taken away from you by someone if you're not aware. So I felt like, wow, this is like, if what you create in the world, you create it first by paying attention to it, and the attention was the glucose. Like the scientists were learning that we use glucose up the most when we paid attention, which is why most of our decision making is unconscious. So we use it sparingly, and it's very important what we pay attention to. So I started to play around with that, really looking at, what did I want and what happened when I paid attention to that. And I quickly saw results. So I feel like those are the three things, really paying attention, ultimately to energy, and seeing it as something that is the currency with which you build your life.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit? I want to go here first, and then I want to come back to what you were just talking about. But can you talk a little bit about? You talk a lot about dominance and resistance, and then you talk about anxiety and joy. Can you put all of that for us in terms of how you make choices that out of your mindset that get you to a place that is more life-giving? Because one of the things that you do mention a lot in your book is that you want to get to a place where your interactions are more life-giving than not, more life-giving than life-draining.
Yes.
And energy draining. So how do you put those four concepts together?
Yeah, well, I think I would add subordination, because I started to look at when I talked about power, when I looked at it, there were different definitions, but they all stemmed around this idea of domination and subordination, that there was this dynamic at play there. And I also, so in the book, in the chapter that came out today on NPQ's daily newsletter, The Transmission of Affect, Teresa Brennan, who actually created that concept, was a professor of mine in graduate school. I did a graduate degree in feminist theory years ago. And, what happened to me through writing this book is whenever an idea or a concept really needed to be part of my thinking, it would just kind of resonate. It would stand out for me. And I remember when I met her and she talked about this transmission of affect, I was blown away, because what she did in that book, she was a Lacanian. She actually died after she wrote that book, right afterwards. But she was a Lacanian, and what she offered was this idea that this was all based on neuroendocrinology, which is a pretty recent field where because of the development of different tools, doctors, scientists, researchers can actually look at what happens in a body when it is subject to domination. And what they found was that there were two core states of being. We have lots of feelings and emotions, but the two core human states are anxiety and joy. And so anxiety is what we would call stress, anger, fear, all those things. But really what happens was that they could see what happens to our body under anxiety. And it actually looks like a body dying. It actually is. Your body actually starts to decompose when you expose it to a lot of anxiety. On the other hand, when you exposed your body to joy, it actually flourished. And so there was this way to start to look at these really core dynamics of subordination and domination as being an offloading. So what I realized was that, and this is what Teresa Brennan really offered, and she kind of hints at it. I kind of picked that up as the main point of her book. But one of the things that she says is that when you are to be dominant is to be, or what I infer from what she found was that to be dominant is to be able to offload your anxiety onto other people. And to be subordinate is to be required, asked to upload other people's anxiety. And so what happens is that that's cumulative. So if you live in a society where, because of how you're positioned, you are asked to upload anxiety on a daily basis, as happens, for example, with Black people in Black communities. I live in a Black community. I see it when I go home on the bus. You see the level of stress that's just layered upon layer of interaction and just being thought less of. I mean, that accumulates in a person's body and it does something to them. So, so the task there is to not offload anxiety onto others, to find ways to be aware of when we're doing that as dominant people. I mean, we could all do that. And I think what's beautiful about this, or not beautiful, but it's beautiful in its simplicity, is that everyone plays these roles. It doesn't really matter who you are, and even more so, you see the same exact dynamics being played out by social change agents. So we all have the ability to be dominant in some instances. And so being careful not to do that, but also if you are on, one of those people who's asked to upload other people's anxiety, how to learn to not do that is the task. So I think, there's a lot more on how to do that in the book, but I think that's one of the major concepts, is that it's really about managing yourself. And actually, what's really interesting too is that managing anxiety is something that you learn as a child. So it's cumulative all the way through from being a child and how you are parented. So I have two children. I learned that one of the most important things one can do as a parent is teach your child to self-soothe, to be able to manage their body when they are overcome with anxiety. Especially as, when you're little, you do that. And it's like when a parent picks up a child and sort of rubs him or her because they felt like what we're actually doing is calming that person's neural system. And so the more you're able to, you grow up in a family, or, you're lucky enough to be soothed when you're anxious and to learn how to soothe yourself, then you can be one of those people who watch the world more carefully, leaving light in your wake or life, as opposed to draining energy. But that's all in the book. But yeah, it's kind of something that happens everywhere in society, and we learn to either be anxious people or to learn how to be joyful. So I think that's a skill, and I practice trying to be joyful and try to bring that around me, spread that around me.
I want to go to one of and I do want to just remind people, you can ask questions in the panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And please feel free. And Cindy, just answer this one real quickly. Please share again the name of the feminist scholar you referenced regarding uploading anxiety.
Yes, Teresa Brennan. Her book is called Transmission of Affect.
Okay, so what strikes me about the dominant subordinate interactions and the uploading of anxiety is that anxiety really flourishes in ambiguous situations, in situations in which people say one thing is going on and really a number of people in the situation think another thing is going on, and there's no way to really resolve that in a straightforward way. And that about epitomizes white curated spaces, as you talked about in our nonprofits white space article, that the conversations between people when there is a power dynamic that's playing out underneath things is very anxiety producing, and it causes people to kind of protect themselves and insist upon their own point of view, and then also other people to not say what they really have to say in that situation. And so all of your communications get kind of hijacked. I remember seeing a tweet that's saying, here's my experience of my internal dialogue in my mostly white organization. Don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, don't say it, you know? And so when that's going on as in a whole environment, are there ways that you can talk about breaking through those kinds of stalemates?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things I really aim to do with this book is kind of bring some language to what can be a pretty hard to discuss and invisible set of dynamics. And so I think really it just comes down to how people interact. And I think that's what's so beautiful about it because, to back up a little bit, when you asked me why I wrote this book, I think one of the reasons was that I had spent so much time reading and studying this area. And then I thought, what we wanted from each other as social change agents was such a high bar around these issues. It was like this disconnect between what it took to interact the way that we wanted to interact with what we wanted to see in the world and what we actually could learn in any given amount of time. So I think bringing things down to the human level into interactions really makes it easy to figure out a lot of these dynamics. And so for me, what I really notice, especially like when I go into organizations, is the way that people interact. That's the first thing I notice. And how much of that is how much mutuality, how much unquestioned dominance is there, especially built into the system. And it's just as rampant in the nonprofit sector as anywhere else. And I think it's even harder because it doesn't match up to our belief systems in a lot of ways. So I think that can be particularly hard for people of color who in those systems are the ones who bear the brunt of that dissonance. I think it really actually can make you sick. I talk to a lot of practitioners of color in the sector, and I would easily say that's the number one thing that I hear as a challenge. You see people really beleaguered by this disconnect and by, how do you talk about it? So I think I wanted my book to offer that, to offer, these simple ways of talking about things that are not just based on ideas and intellect, but really about humanness and how do we interact and how we treat each other. It's just as simple
Right.
as that.
Right. So I want to go to a quote from your book. This is going back to what you were talking about right before I asked you that question. You wrote at one point, affect begins with an impulse, which is a sudden urge that prompts an unpremeditated act, and over time an inclination. If one follows one's impulses without reflection, one will not be able to notice, much less change the direction of the pathway. And I just think that's such an important it's such an important insight, that practice without reflection and without thorough reflection is relatively powerless. So, can you talk a little bit about how people can actually reflect on their own practice? What are the steps that they need to get to? Because, is part of the way we act from day to day, driven by unseen forces that are in our childhoods or in our environments, may be visible to us, and part of it may not be visible to us. So, how do we measure and reflect on our own practices?
Well, in the book, there are different frameworks that are pretty simple, although there are a few of them to use at different times. But I think the most basic practice is really one of first asking a question whether something, either in retrospect or at the moment, is bringing you closer to someone or farther away. So that's almost like the most basic thing you can use as a guide. If you have no frameworks and you want to get a sense of, what's right, does this bring me closer to this person or does it push me farther away? I think besides that, there is this really simple, very human process of development, which is basically to act, to reflect on that action, and then to make a choice about what you would do next time. And so I think that what I've noticed is when something is new as an experience, oftentimes we do that in retrospect. Like we kind of like go through the experience, we kind of try to make the best sense of it, and then afterwards, sometimes we're left with this lingering imprint of that interaction. And for the most part, it feels, usually when it's what's power driven, it feels very you feel really uneasy, you feel anxious, and then you go, well, why do I feel that way? And then if you really start to think about it, you can think about what was the event that happened that made that brought that on, and then you can think about whether it came from you, whether it came from the other person. How does that match what you really kind of want as a human? And then what would you do the next time? And so that happens over and over. It's a basic reflection practice, happens over and over again. And what I realize is that there are sets of events. So once you have a series of events, after a while, you learn how to make the shift while it's happening. So I'm always at this point, because I've been practicing for a while, I'm always really noticeable. I really notice when something is new that throws me off. And then I go, wow, that's exciting. What is this? Because it's almost like this is the edge of my practice, right? Like, why do I feel bad about this? And then I'll do that thinking. And usually it's because it's something new, something that I haven't experienced in quite this way before. Power just shifts and has so many ways that it functions. And it's really like walking into the world a certain way. It's a stance of how to move through the world, not taking on the low opinion of others and not having low opinion of others. And so it's really hard to do that in our society. So our interactions with each other, what you recall from the book as social dramas, are those moments where power interactions happen in a day-to-day situation. And usually those will have an imprint. Sometimes, if we're lucky, they're really good. And then you feel really great about something that you were able actually to grow power in an interaction or to shift. And, oftentimes, and it's funny now, probably because I've written this book, I get a lot of people that call me for what I informally call power consulting. And so people will call me and or talk to me and say, this happened. And oftentimes when I say to the person, well, what power did you have in that situation? It's usually the most important question. Sometimes it's hard for people to answer that question. And I almost never have people answer it on the spot. Usually people are either really shocked because they didn't think about that. And then they go, I have to think about that. I have to really think about that. So really look for the power you have always. There's so many ways to be powerless, but being powerful is really cool and fun if it's done the right way. You can actually look for that.
Well, I want to ask you one more question from me, and then I've got a bunch from other people. And for me, it's like I know you well enough. Cindy and I share an office. And so if things go wrong between Cindy and I, being that we're both Aries, we have to have it out.
Yeah.
And that at least keeps us up to date with whatever power dynamics are going on. I think not in a wholly perfect way, but in a way that I think probably helps us both develop and learn. It certainly helps me. But I wonder what you can say to people about, you're a fairly bold person and you've been doing this all your life, and you have no compunction in bringing up things that you feel like need to be brought up. For people for whom that's not a habit, what is it that they need to do? And this is actually put in another way by one of the participants. What process do you see people walking through when they go from internalized powerlessness to living in their agency?
Wow. I think, there's, yeah, I'm going to try to, I might have to ask you to repeat the second question, but I think the easy answer to the first question is that, so I kind of confused the two questions. The first question you asked was how does someone, okay, I get it now. So I think one of the things that I've learned is that the better you get at this, the less in your face it is. So I talk a lot about this idea of gracefulness, and I feel the most powerful when I don't really have to do anything, where sometimes merely the taking away of my attention from something and putting it on something else, it's in how you behave. So you can be in a place where everyone's behaving badly, and if you come with a bigger affect, an affect that includes more and makes more possible, everyone will notice. You don't really have to do anything. So I think when it has to be said, that's one thing, but not all of us have the words or the time, the space, the time to, the wanting to put everything. I don't always put everything into words. I do that with you because we work together and I care about our relationship, but there are a lot of dynamics that I ignore.
Right.
because I just decide that they're not worth my time. And it's really helps. So I think I very jealously guard my energy and my attention. And that doesn't have to show up as speech. It can
Right.
show up in your actions and what you pay attention to, um, and just how you treat other people.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the process that people go through from internalized oppression to having a sense of one's power, I see that as a lifelong practice of realization. I think there are many ways that we can express our power, and our power, I feel, is can always expand. I don't think one is ever done, but I think in terms of internalized oppression, I talk about this in my book, for people who are continuously asked to take on low opinions of themselves in order to function in the world, the the job is to not center those ways of thinking in your life. It is to turn away from dominant narratives and to turn away from those things, both in how you see yourself and how you see others. So I think that's a place to start, is actually to just turn away from the dominant narrative. And then you can begin to explore where your power is. But I think when people are
Can you
really,
talk a little bit more about that narrative, the concept of narrative, and how to use that?
yeah, well, the first section of the book, it has four sections, and the first one is all about identity. So it was really fascinating. I think that's probably my favorite section of the book. But
Yeah.
it's where you really start to understand that your basic identity is somewhere along the lines of powerful and powerless, right? And so there's like this continuum. And so you when you're subordinate in society, when you're classified that way, and I differentiate later on in the book between the way that society assigns you status and the way one assigns oneself status. Those can be at odds. But when you are subordinated by society, asked to play low status roles permanently, say women, Black people, children, people of color, immigrants, um, the the narrative is you're basically invited to have a powerless identity, to speak with powerlessness. Everything that you do and think about is from the stance of powerlessness. So you think about the words you use. Some things happen to you. I mean, the narrative is the story that's running in your mind as well, and how much that is kind of coming in from outside when it's not you're seen that way. And so it's really paying attention to that, paying attention to like, I mean, it's so hard and also very easy to pay attention to the words that we use to describe what is happening to us. You have total control of how you describe an event, an experience. I mean, an experience can happen, and then you decide the meaning it has. You decide the story it tells. So, paying attention to that. How many of your narratives are self-created versus, given to you? How many of the ones that are given to you are asking you to play powerless roles? Um, and then how do you interrupt that? How do you learn to be powerful in a way that's more liberatory? And there's nothing wrong with being powerful, but it's sort of like that initial way that we identify. And again, I talk about this in the second section of the book, but this is developmental. Like, we grow up in families, we learn all this in our families and in schools, and then we grow up and it happens in the workplace. But in one's family, when you're between the ages of 2 and 5, it's when you're learning your first initial power imprint, right? So however your parents or whoever is your caretaker responds to your demands, to your needs, you're going to have a quick sense of whether you can do that in the world or whether you can't. And so, it's something that I have two children. I have a 19-year-old and a 10-year-old, and I'm very careful when they ask for things to be aware of their right to ask that, and how to talk to them, how to say yes or no about that, and how to value the fact that they know what they want. And so I do a lot of that so that they learn to trust themselves, and they learn that when they have needs, they may not always get them met, but they'll sense that there's a fairness to that. And so if you haven't had that as a child, and there are many reasons why many people don't, and that's not always to do with race and class, it has to do with family and ours, so there's a lot of overlapping here, but it's, you can change it, but you kind of have to go back to those moments in your life where you learned whether you could be a powerful person in the world or not, whether you can have your demands met or not. Right. And then also how to respect the demands of others. So, that keeps going, but yeah.
So, just these next two questions are kind of linked. But the first one is, Cindy, how do you keep in control of your behavior whenever faced with an aggressive, dominant approach from white individuals in a workplace or from your experience and try to avoid reflecting a reaction that would make them stick to a stereotype or relate your behavior to your ethnicity, background as a person of color.
Very good one. Well, there are a lot of ways I do that, but I think I think the first step in a lot of situations when you're learning to do this is simply to not do anything. I remember when I was younger and starting off in the sector, when I realized that if someone said something to me and I wasn't ready to respond, I didn't have to. That was a real powerful realization. I think when I was in my 20s, and I did have a pretty white dominant male boss who would try to corner me and ask me questions and demand answers. I learned to just say, I don't know yet. I need to get back to you. And so just honoring the space to take in space to decide what to do. I think I do that a lot now. And I never thought I could. I remember when I was a kid, I would just react. And I remember I had a friend who would say, she would tell me things, and then I would say, are you going to do something about it? And she goes, well, I'm waiting for the right time. And I used to just think, wow, what a concept, to wait for the right time. And I always remembered that. So I mean, take the time and think about it. Don't react in the moment. Just make sure, when you feel yourself kind of feel that anxiety. I mean, it's very easy to feel it, like the kind of nervous heart palpitations. It's like a stress response. When you feel yourself having that response, honor yourself first, take a deep breath and don't feel like you have to respond at all. That can be hard. And I think with all of this, for me, I don't really know if I could do any of this without having a strong spiritual practice. So I have been meditating for many years, probably 20 plus years. And so that helps. All of that helps. It's all about being able to have more and more direction setting control for your mind, for your consciousness, and whatever it is in your life that helps you do that. After a while, you'll figure out whatever it is for that circumstance that triggered it, what it is that you have to do. And I don't have an answer that would apply to any situation, except, just taking the time and going deep inside. That's what works for me. And then figuring out, what do I want out of this?
Right.
And then usually because I have the words and I have studied it, I can oftentimes have a conversation with the person if I choose to, in a way that I can explain something in a way that doesn't diminish them. So that's really hard to do. And then when you do that, you invite someone into a bigger humanity, you automatically, I think, overstep those kind of racial classification kind of stereotypes we have about each other, because you're just being really human and thoughtful. And if you can do that for someone else, people will recognize that. That's what I've noticed. People recognize that and they really respect it.
I like that, inviting someone to a bigger humanity, because I do think, I think that's part of this process that you talk about throughout the book. I want to, well, first of all, I want to, this reminds me of some other conversations that you and I have had, but Valerie, hi Valerie, asks, what are some examples of symptoms of domination that might not be so obvious? And Cindy always says, to whom?
Right, because it's really obvious to some of us. Well, in the book, in the second chapter, I talk about the 7 sort of dominant ways of thinking that perpetuate domination. And they're really not anything that we would ever think of. And that's what makes them so powerful. So one of them, for example, is removing an event from history, right? So the idea that you can talk about an event that's happening now and take it away from history in and of itself is a domination practice, right? Because it allows things to not have a power valence, which they do, right? So, there are lots of things like that. But I think what I look for are those patterns or those kind of frameworks that apply across situation. I really look for simplicity because this is such a complex topic. But I think, removing things from history is one of them. This idea of objectivity is another. The idea that there's something can be known. Someone recently used this term, I think it was Hari Kondabolu, he used the term narrative abundance. It's really kind of respecting that you have one stance and that someone else might have another, and that you can meet somewhere and kind of, connect. But so there are 7 of those patterns in the book. And I think that, the idea of being able to say something without having to back it up, authority, that's another domination tactic. So the ones that I pay attention to are ones that would be considered really normal human Western behavior.
Yeah. All right. You mentioned that acceptance of domination has held back social movements. Could you talk about how, if social movements and their members were more conscious of their own power, this would increase their efficacy? And can you share any examples of social movement learning in this regard?
You know,
Have
I'm
we
kind of
evolved at all?
Oh, I think there's been huge evolution in the time that I've been working in the sector. The fact that we have social movements alive and well, that wasn't the case when I started off in the sector in the 90s. And so, not that there weren't movements, but big social movements. But I think, I'll give one example, and it actually came from a friend of mine, Gibran Rivera, who does facilitation with a lot of social movement groups, mostly retreats and things like that, really intense transformation type of experiences. And he did an interview with me that's on my website, part of his podcast. And in it, he posed a question that we often talk about as friends, which is how hard it is for him to facilitate spaces of people where there is a lot of powerless identity coming into the conversation, and people are trying to move out of that, and without the framework and without the people who are helping them understanding the process, the transformation process. And so that's something that's in the third section of the book, that it's a process to actually shift and to expand your power. And so I think there's a lot of work and intention around creating transformational spaces. And I think that leaders of those spaces, there's a responsibility that goes with that. And I think this is the one thing that I said to my friend, because, he often talked about how frustrating it was for him to facilitate spaces where someone was hurt or felt re-traumatized by something that happened in the group. He would have to stop the group and have a discussion about that, and how it became increasingly hard to finish any retreat, or to kind of move it along in a way that worked for everyone. The more and more people became aware of trauma and being able to speak out about this in a group. So, I talked to him about how does one interact with someone who's having that experience? How do you help someone find, the truth about what happened to them realistically, but also their power in a situation? How do you understand what comes next for this person, so that you can say, this is what's going to happen, or this is what could happen to you? So it's this process of, and I think that's what we're moving into. When I worked with particularly with Black Lives Matter, before I came on 10PQ, I was working as a consultant, and a few of my clients were movement folks. And what I saw a lot was how interesting it was when there was a movement of just Black people, right? Because there's so much that we're always working across difference. And so very rarely do you get to just sit with one group and then see what comes out of that. And so when I covered their convening in Cleveland, their first convening, I was evaluating it. I was blown away by how much conflict there was, by how much tension there was. And it wasn't because I was surprised, but just because I just felt like our sector, so we don't often have a space for just Black folks to work on something together. And then because it was dealing with the issue of crimes, physical harm to people of color, that convening was, the activists were the privileged people. Most of the people in the audience were people who've had family members killed. And so a different constellation came up very quickly in the space of all Black folks. In another situation, those activists may have felt they would have had to, respond to another culture that may have been more dominant. But in that retreat, in that convening, they were the dominant ones as the activists. And so it was really interesting seeing how they responded. In particular, there was, I think there were maybe 1,700 people that came, and it was way more than they expected. And there was a pretty large contingency of trans folks. And they were the ones who felt the most marginalized in that space. And so I was really fascinating to see this whole dynamic with different set of players and how they were responding to each other, given that while, they were, Black folks are part of the dominant society, they're part of the society that has dominance as a way of interacting, but they actually weren't positioned often as dominant. So their response to that was actually really interesting. I remember they stopped. I think what happened, there were maybe like maybe about 100 trans folks. So there was enough that there was a contingency that they could actually say, this isn't fair. They weren't able to use the bathrooms. They were getting kicked out of the clubs. So all the events that were being held for the BLM retreat conference convening, those folks who were trans were actually having a really horrible experience. And so they confronted the rest of the group, and then the group responded, and we had this whole, shifting of what we were going to do, and we had like a public hearing, and people talk. It was just really fascinating. I think what I would have wished would have happened. I mean, obviously the conference wasn't for me. I was there to evaluate it, but we ended up having. I remember Alicia Garza and Patrice. They all held this sort of this space where people could come up and speak to the experience that they were having. And so for about a few hours, people went up and talked about what they were experiencing and what they wanted of us at the conference to have their back. And I listened and I thought, wow, this is really amazing. And I also felt, if there's anyone who really kind of knows how to really grapple with identity and try to create and craft your own identity, it's trans people. So I was like, oh my God, I would have loved to have a panel where they talk about that. So, there are always, ways that you can, move forward. But I think that, that's what I noticed in the space. And for me, it was beautiful to notice because in all of my years, it was the first time. And so the first time that I had seen all Black space and how hard it was to protect it and what happened when it was available. And I actually, one of the things that I want to see more of is some more of that conversation of what happens between people of color. I think a lot of the conversations stay at a certain level because it's always like whites versus people of color. And so there's a lot more there, and there's a lot more for all of us to learn from each other.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't want to get off kind of that feeling of potential. So I don't want to go back to some of these, which are just how do I manage myself in these spaces? Well, I'll do one of them, and I think this is an important one, which is how do you manage the feeling of defeat once you realize the anxiety you experience in the workplace is by design of the hierarchy?
Yeah.
I've taken the approach of when in Rome, and I would like a better way to maneuver. I think so many people feel that way, that in fact the spaces have been designed to basically to support domination, and not allow the full development of either the individuals or the group when you come right down to it. So how would you answer that? How would you manage that feeling of defeat? And is there a better way to maneuver?
Well, that's interesting. I don't know if I've ever felt that defeated. So I kind of question like what is going on in terms of just. So I guess for me, I kind of don't imagine this sort of like perfect world. I kind of know that as I move to the world, there are always going to be things that impinge upon me and things that I do. And so I guess it's more like a spiritual practice that wherever I am, I'm actually looking to see where my power is. And I think I would just say that again. I mean, in any situation, like don't accept defeat. Defeat is only one option. I mean, just continuously look for where there's power. There is power. There's always more to the story that we accept than the story we accept. There's always way more out there that's possible. And sometimes it comes so for example, I actually used to work in a space and I don't think, I mean, I've always worked in spaces where there were dynamics that felt really big. And the more sensitive you get, the more, the bigger those things can seem. So, but I think, I remember working in a space where it was an all white strategy place that I worked at, like a strategy outfit. And, part of it was the culture of how people interacted. And I saw that part of it was for me to help bring more people of color on. So that was one thing. But I was also really hesitant to bring people of color on because I didn't want to bring them into this environment. So I think, over time, I realized that in that network, what mattered was that the people that were running it really felt that they wanted to be masterful, like being good at their jobs really mattered to them. I also realized that because it was a network, that really value networks, my ability to develop my own network served as a counterpart or counterpoint to what was happening in the organization. So I noticed that if something happened in the office, and this is so long ago, I have to think back, but I might bring it up again in the next time that I have the opportunity to at a meeting or something where it's relevant and say, this and this happened, and I talked to some of my colleagues and some of my peers out in the field, and this is what they said. So I started to notice that just the idea that I was sharing some of these ideas with people outside and that I had this network, I started to see people responding differently and to being aware that I had a network. So I think cultivating your own network, seeing that as a power source outside of your organization is really true, especially nowadays. And to let people know that you do have a field and that this organization is just one constellation, right? So that you have a lot of power outside of your organization. And then part of it is how you build it. How do you move in the organization? How are you excellent and masterful at what you do so that you can have power? So there's a lot of different ways to have power, but just question defeat. That's just a closer.
Yeah, I think, I actually think that's so profound what you just said, is that we're not so attached to single organizations anymore, that we need to just see them as the end all be all of our sources of power, even within organizations. We know it's not like that anymore, but it's kind of almost a bigger game now, and perhaps blessedly so. That bigger game actually has the potential of changing things on smaller game boards, which is the way it almost feels to me. And I wonder if, on that note, Cindy, you could talk a little bit about, is there anything that you feel you had just finished this book as you came into NPQ to start working with us, and part of what you do obsessively is track what's going out there in the world of social movement, and particularly around racial equity stuff, but also around other forms of social justice. And I wonder if there's anything that's come to you since the writing of the book that you feel like, and then there's this, which we should feel hopeful about or desperate about.
It's interesting because what it makes me think of is this idea that I have for my next book, which I'm sort of tentatively calling Radical Democracy. And it's almost like taking what's going on in this book to a different level. And I think it's because of what's happening in our country politically. I think when I finished the book was right when I remember when I first even sent my book into publishers, some of them, it was right when Donald Trump had gotten elected. So that definitely was a big game changer, and it made me kind of expand on those original ideas. So I think more and more I'm looking at how do we move to sort of organizational levels of thinking about this. And I'm kind of thinking about it as radical democracy. It's really this idea of a space that's more public, where these interactions can be more obvious and negotiated and explicit and legitimate narrative.
Right. So thank you so much, Cindy. This has been so much fun. And feels what we do normally during the day a little bit. But also, I do want to say that I think, what Cindy is talking about here is a real consciousness of using oneself in a strategic way, not dishonest, but strategic, and resisting the narratives that come to us that aren't necessarily true, or that we build in ourselves that aren't necessarily true if they make us powerless. And so some of the, when you feel anxiety raising, when you feel defeated, when you feel like, I can't get in a word edgewise here, that's when I think, when you're feeling that anxiety uploading, that you have to question, where am I placing myself? Where do I need to place myself? What is it about this situation that isn't working? And then how do I manage it? How do I deal with it? So I want to thank you very much, Cindy. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we?
No, I think just to urge people to think about the power they have and how to build it and how to use it for good in the world. That actually, I mean, I think it's a counterpart to the kind of what we're seeing at the bigger level politically. And I think it's important to remember that that's not where power is, that the power is with you. And in every minute of the day, you have a choice about what you do, whether what you do interrupts that or contributes to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Cindy. And if you want to order Cindy's book, you can either get it from New Society Publishers from their website at www.newsociety.com, or you can wait for our follow-up email to you and we will send you that link. And I do want to say that Cindy is one of our new senior editors, and we've been very thoughtful about the way we bring people on, and we bring people on for their ability to challenge ways of thinking that have not been productive for us in the past. And so thank you very much for bringing all of yourself today to this interview, Cindy. And we will be talking to you all soon. Thanks.